Good evening. Welcome to the last evening event of this year's lectures and discussions. Getting out of the traditional studio. Some of our students, or many of our students, unfortunately don't get out of their traditional studio tonight, but I'm very happy that you all are here. I just want to present to you Raimar Stange, who is the moderator tonight. He's an art critic, journalist, and curator, and at the moment he is preparing a show for the Salzburger Kunstverein, which you can see this fall, I think. So I immediately give the word to Raimar.
Thank you. Good night, ladies and gentlemen. Because I'm a curator, I'm friends with a lot of artists. For example, Jonathan Monk, a British neo-conceptual artist. He doesn't have a real studio. He works most of the time in an office in his house. A friend of his, Simon Starling, has a studio in Copenhagen, but he refused to have more than 5 assistants. His argument, if I had more, I would lose control over my work. On the other hand, an artist like Olafur Eliasson has a factory-like studio in Berlin. More than 50 people are working there. Our topic tonight is, to make it short and simple, does working in a studio still shape the production of an artist? And if so, does it make sense in postmodern times to leave the studio? The studio seems to be more or less the normal place of production for art objects which you can see later in galleries or other exhibitions. So maybe leaving the studio would rescue art from being just a fetish for collectors or museums. My thesis is, still most artists work in a studio, probably even more than in the 60s or 90s. What we see now in the art world is a conservative, market-orientated backlash. The return of the studio is one symptom of that. Let me now introduce the participants of our panel tonight. Ladies first, Carrie Young. She's a London-based artist who works with performance and other media. She worked very often in so-called public spaces, for example, at Speakers' Corners in London, but she will tell us more about her own work. We have another artist here tonight, my longtime friend Christian Jankowski, based in Berlin. He's well known for his video art. Maybe you know films like Supermarket, Telemystica, or Casting Jesus. Wouter is a curator and writer, and he's also professor for modern art. He's based in Amsterdam. Last but not least, another professor, Philipp Ursprung, based in Zurich. He teaches art and architecture at the university in Zurich, and he's also a writer. Each of them will give a short, about 50 minutes long statement. The 4 statements will be followed by a discussion, but in between we will make a short break for cigarettes and wine. Let's start with Carrie Young, please.
Okay, firstly, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. And just before we get going on the content, I'll just say that I've never had a studio. So just to leave that thought in your mind. Okay, so just a brief glimpse at my work and some of the things that inform it. I just want to give you a flavour, particularly with the mind of where does the work come from in the sense of inspiration, and how does that link to the idea of a studio and the idea of the place of thinking becoming part of the fabric of the work. So in 1997, I finished a master's in photography at the Royal College of Art in London, and my work at the time was very concerned with technology and the increasing technologization of the world. And through a kind of accidental meeting, I met someone who was working for a management consultancy specializing in new technologies, and she was an artist. And it just turned out they had a job going, and they offered me this job. So imagine 3 weeks after leaving art college with my master's, I suddenly walked into this management consultancy with a suit on, with a part-time job. And, you know, as an artist up until that point, I'd been rather anti-capitalist. But I decided to take this job because I thought it might give me some possibilities for artistic collaboration in some way. And it was a kind of an experiment that I could just leave if I wasn't happy with. So I stayed there for 4.5 years, and the picture you're seeing on the screen here is of those kind of banal meeting spaces, entrance spaces, the non-spaces of the corporate world, where actually a lot of thinking, planning, and influence over society is staged and takes place. So this kind of space started to become, you know, a place where I spent a lot of my time. And it became, I would say, a source of artistic inspiration for me, not just in terms of interior design and architecture, but really particularly in terms of the conversations that I was able to hear and the information that I had access to. Now, management consultants deal with companies and governments, governmental organizations from all sectors of society. And so I was hearing about, it was like science fiction in a way, I was hearing about the near future of what all these organizations were planning and thinking about. And then that started to become part of my artwork. So, and even to the extent that I would come in on my days off, dressed in a suit, just so I could carry on working. So I started to use the office as my studio, but without telling anyone. I never asked permission, but I just kind of used to come in and hang around and listen, and used a suit as a kind of camouflage, really, so no one would be suspicious. So in the office, you would have these terrible, you know, depressing workspaces like this with art hiding on the walls. But really, the corporate world these days is obsessed with, or has been, obsessed with creativity. So you'd have spaces like this. The Brainstorm Room. This is actually at the BBC, where I also had a residency. Now, importantly, the Brainstorm Room is a site for creative thinking, but as you'll see, there is no window on the door, so it's impossible to see what's inside, and it looks very intimidating, like it might be a dentist's chair or something, you know, about pain. But inside was this very sad scene where you can see that creativity is something that's become alien, and it's something to be celebrated, but it's also, you can see it's something that has to be made into an event, like let's celebrate our creativity and let's have a creativity session and get in touch with our inner creative. And there's something really sad about that. But as an artist, you suddenly become this kind of special person in that situation, which means you get access to all sorts of events and conversations that became material for me. To give you a wider perspective, not only did I work at this management consultancy for 4.5 years, but I also then went to work for a left-wing left-wing think tank called the New Economics Foundation. Could you switch the light off, please? Thank you. So the New Economics Foundation, I worked there for 3 years. So it's almost like the opposite of the corporate sector. They specialize in anti-capitalist thinking, but at the level of creating serious kind of reports for the media with lots of research behind them. So it's almost like an inverse of the corporate sector, and I went to work there for 3 years. So that also became an influence on my work. So that gives you the kind of essence of my practice, in the sense that these workspaces became a kind of research base for me, and I felt that they were kind of like paid research, that even though I had a desk job where I was doing kind of ordinary office work, I was also using these locations as a place for getting my material. So the work now that I'm going to show you has all come out of that experience. Very briefly, I'll just talk about this work. This is Everything You've Heard Is Wrong. It's actually a video of a performance that I gave at Speaker's Corner in London. You see me dressed in a suit. Speaker's Corner, very famously, is a site for free speech, and in theory, anyone can go there and say anything, And on Sundays, there is a tradition of crowds gathering on Sunday mornings to listen to these impromptu speeches. And it's got a kind of very strong political tradition. But it's also known as a place to go and hear extremes of opinion, like extreme religious views, crazy stuff. I am giving a speech about how to give a corporate presentation. So it's a workshop in presentation skills. So the idea is that it's a kind of corporate figure who's trying to self-replicate through the crowd by passing on her skills in public speaking. By implication, that information is passed on to the audience in the gallery. So this collapsing of the categories between culture, politics, and business is summed up by this location, I think, the public space that's being co-opted by this corporate figure, who's also an artist. And that is the site of the work. So not the actual physical location, but actually the kind of idea of the relationship between culture, politics, and business. That is the site. And I imagine that this evening we're going to talk a lot about site. And so I put that to you as the first suggestion, really, that, a kind of relationship between different spheres, culture, politics, and business, that's the site for my work. Now, I want to show you how that works by actually showing you a video now. So this is a piece from 2007 called Product Recall, and it features a series of advertising slogans about creativity. So these are all slogans that are being featured in adverts associated with big multinational corporations. And all those corporations associate themselves with creativity, and all the companies that are featured in this work, they all sponsor art fairs, art galleries, museums, and exhibitions.
Come in. Hi, Carrie. Welcome back.
Hello.
Please make yourself comfortable.
Thanks.
How did you do today?
Yeah, better. Definitely better. A bit tired, but generally much better.
Good, that's great. So, for today's session, I thought we'd go through some of those advertising slogans again and see how many you remember and how many you managed to forget. I picked slogans from the past 5 years that appeared in print, TV ads, or which are company trademarks. They're all associated with well-known companies. That sound okay?
Yeah, let's try it.
Fine. So, in your own time, please tell me the company slogans, the company names associated with the following slogans. Think different.
Apple.
Correct. Invent.
Hewlett Packard.
Correct. Imagination at work.
General Electric.
Correct. Change the way you see the world.
No.
Okay. Ideas for life.
Not sure.
All right. Invented for life.
Hitachi.
Knowledge without boundaries.
HSBC.
Ideas you can't live without.
That's gone.
Where imagination begins.
Not sure about that.
It's not that hard to imagine.
No.
Okay. It's boundless creativity.
Louis Vuitton.
Passionate exhibiting?
Citibank.
Creative business.
That is the Financial Times.
Correct. Investing in creative futures.
I think that is Unilever.
Correct. Leading innovation.
I've forgotten.
A passion for innovation.
I've gone to.
Driving innovation.
Bienvenue.
Correct. Innovation changes everything.
That one. I don't know.
Inspiration comes as standard.
No. No, I didn't.
How do you capture inspiration?
I don't know.
All right, Carrie, that's all. Thank you. Now, I think we should take a short break and then come back to this in a few moments.
Okay.
Have you two guys water?
Yeah. Thank you.
Here you go.
Thanks.
Okay, it's actually really funny that you had the script there, because actually the script, I'd actually forgotten which companies were associated with it. It's been years since I looked at that script. But the point of the work is how similar those statements actually are when you collect them together. These companies spend millions of pounds developing this stuff, and yet they can't colonize our imagination because at some point, if you can't remember the information, then that is actually a form of resistance to branding. And ultimately, my work does play a game around resistance and co-option and complicity. And these are all very intangible issues. So it's not about the physical issue of us having a studio. What's at stake in my work is, this idea of the kind of mental space of the artist or of creativity or of art, and then to what extent has that been colonized by corporate values, or in a wider sense, to what extent has that space been colonized in all of us by corporate power? So, often my work operates in a kind of psychological domain, and I don't really see a studio as useful for that, except in a practical sense, and that I think is the least interesting issue. So, I also wanted to show you this, because I've started to make a body of work around law as well. So, I see law as a separate institution to business in the sense that it has a very different tradition and history. Of course, it's very linked to business, but it's much more about human rights and this idea of what should be protected about a person and how can we punish a person, which is also often a physical issue, physical punishment, denying us freedom, denying us access to the world. It's a very powerful area to work with artistically. And I'm interested in making artworks which are also works of law. So they operate as real legal instruments and they have a legal validity. I often work with lawyers to make these works. And for example, this piece here, Declared Void, uses a contract. It's a contractual offer to the viewer. So you're offered the ability to step inside this zone depicted in the gallery and to step outside the US Constitution by so doing. Contractually speaking, that is actually impossible in terms of politics. But as a contract, it's actually legally valid, and thus it has the same kind of logic as Guantanamo and this idea of a kind of legal grey area, the space that is outside the law, is outside the state, and it appears to be hovering in a kind of non-space that's outside of sort of normal social rules and protections. So it's kind of a challenge to the viewer and a kind of platform for performance. You either choose to go in or you choose not to go in. This piece can only be exhibited in America. And there's lots more to say about this. I'm not sure how much time I've got left. So nothing. I've gone over, have I? Okay, well, I'll leave it at that. But just to sum up, all these works use a kind of ready-made devices from the corporate or the legal worlds, but they're adapted by me into works. They're not just pure ready-mades. And the political aspect of the work is very much an intention of provoking the audience to think about ideas of complicity and also to provoke discussion about our own values and a kind of response to the corporate and legal lockdown of everything in our lives. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Alan Capro's environments and happenings of the 1960s, such as Yard, Household, and Fluids, have entered the canon of art history. The current debate about performativity, the discussion about participation, and the question of the post-studio situation refer to these works of art. As in art history in general, which privileges the 60s and 70s over the 60s over the 70s and the 80s, the reception of Capro's work mainly focuses on the early phase of his career. The so-called activities of the 70s and 80s remain in the shadow of the earlier, more spectacular happenings, yet they deserve our attention. In activities such as ecology, Capro replaces the heroic gesture and the narrative of his early oeuvre by a more intimate form. The separation between performers and audience has disappeared. Furthermore, the mystery of the ephemeral nature of the happenings, the viewer being confronted with random documentary photography, is gone. Capro plays with open cards, giving the reader all the information at hand in guise of small booklets that both contain the score and the documentation of the activities. Now, what can we learn from Capro's activities in relation to our topic, the issue of getting out of the studio? I'm interested less in describing Capro's studio as such. The studio that I saw when I visited Capro in the late 1990s was quite conventional. A shed in his backyard with a desk, with a telephone, with his files, with paper and typewriters. My point is that the discussion of the studio should include the socio-economic context, what Carrie Young has very brilliantly just described. Its function and history relates to issues such as the conception of the objects, the conception of space, temporality, value, labor, and commodification. In order to approach this issue, I want to ask how Capro's activities can be related in the history of economics, and particularly in the economic shift that happens during the early 1970s, mid-1970s, that what we now know as the beginning of the globalized economy, the recession of the 70s, oil crisis. Here you have a diagram showing how the currency exchange rates start to oscillate after Richard Nixon takes the dollar off the gold standard and sort of triggers the deregulation of the market and opens the gates to the creation of the finance industry. So the starting point of our own current economic situation. This is last year's OECD report, Divided We Stand, which sort of gives a view back to this phase, which starts in the early 70s. The most interesting theoretician, in my view, looking at these issues is David Harvey, and he looks at the early 70s and says that the breakdown of money as a secure means of representing value, the dollar being not anymore linked to the gold standard, is itself created a crisis of representation in advanced capitalism. So I'm interested how this shift, this economic shift, affects our perception of space and time, our conception of the work of art, and also of human labor. My subject matter is the activity Ecology, performed on a weekend of May 3rd and 4th, 1975, by Alan Caprow with a group of participants in New Jersey. There was no audience. A booklet with a score and some photographs documenting the event are all that remain. Here is the score. 1. Carrying some downstream water a distance upstream, bucket by bucket, pouring it into stream, transferring a mouthful of upstream water a distance downstream, mouth to mouth, spitting it into the stream. 2. Sending a mouthed silent word a distance upstream, person by person, saying it aloud to the trees, propelling a shouted word a distance downstream, person by person, mouthing it to the sky. 3. Transporting a gas-soaked cloth a distance upstream, waving it gently in the air, person to person, waving it gently dry, carrying a bagged breath a distance downstream, each adding a breath, opening the bag to the wind. At the end of the booklet, Caprow provides an interpretation of his work. He states that ecology is, quote, concerned with natural processes. Water flowing downstream is carried mechanically upstream, is dumped and flows back. Some is lost along the way. More water is transferred downstream, mouth by mouth, loses oxygen, is mixed with saliva, and is given back to the stream to be altered again. Of course, Caprow had to prepare the score, write letters, make telephone calls, arrange the contract with the gallery, book flights, etc., somewhere, very likely, in his studio. But I find more important for our subject matter the question how the production of the work of art and its presence relate. As usual with Caprow's work, ecology is site-specific to an environment. Here it's an outdoor environment in an idyllic landscape, a little stream, a small group of people. At first sight, ecology seems to echo the ideology of the environmentalist movements of the early 70s and the Zen-like style of John Cage, Caprow's teacher. The playful, cooperative kind of work which recalls Quakers erecting a barn together and which is typical for many of Caprow's happening of the 60s, such as fluids, prevails. Furthermore, it evokes images of the pioneers of the environmental protection, such as Greenpeace, founded in 1971. However, if we consider the motive of the gas-soaked cloth, the spitting of water into the stream, the loss of water during various steps of transporting it, and the alteration of meaning during the process of transmitting language, the Romanticist association is too narrow. The motive of waste contradicts the ecologist ideology, which is based on conserving resources. So rather than adhering to the quasi-romantic and cyclical conceptions of the ecological movement, Caprow's motifs echo, I would argue, the notion of discontinuity. While an echo usually acts as a mirror, reflects and brings back a sound, the echoes of ecology are interrupted and discontinuous. So which is the status of the work of art, the product coming out of the studio, if you like, in this activity? Capro never is interested in the idea of dematerialization of the work of art that is postulated by the protagonists of conceptual art. Nor does he intend to transform the object into a process in the sense of performance art. He never speaks about the post-studio issue either. The very distinction between idea and object, which lays at the heart of the idea of dematerialization and was cherished by his contemporaries and all the Marcel Duchamp followers, makes no sense in Capro's oeuvre. His thinking is deeply rooted in American pragmatism, for instance in John Dewey, and not in European idealism. If there is a historical model for his conception of the place of the work of art in society, it's not the elitist model of the European avant-gardes, but rather the Works Progress Administration as part of the New Deal of the 30s, where artists had their place within society and could play an active role in the economic recovery process after the great crash of 1929. Unlike his European colleagues, Capro never conceived art as an autonomous sphere distanced from society, but intertwined with everyday life. In consequence, the studio cannot be a place of melancholic retreat or distance, but has to be accessible in the sense of an office. I would argue that our view of the studio tends to remain trapped in a strangely anachronistic perspective. We imagine a kind of an ontological status of the studio from the medieval workshop to the World Wide Web, and therefore reinforce the very myth that we try to deconstruct. The pragmatic nature of Capro encourages us to focus on the change of human labor that takes place during the period where disindustrialization, deregulation, and recession intertwine. So this early 70s period where I'm focusing on, and which is of course in our current situation very much related to what's happening now, has been theorized by many specialists, and there are various concepts to describe the change that happens at that time. For instance, describing the tradition from a Fordist to a post-Fordist economic structure. In reference to our subject matter, I find particularly useful the concept of immaterial labor. In other words, the replacement of industrial product-oriented labor by post-industrial labor focused on immaterial values such as knowledge, language, images, affects, slogans. This concept was developed, among others, by Maurizio Lazzarato, Paolo Virno, and Antonio Negri. And in Lazzarato's view, I quote, immaterial labor involves a series of activities that are not normally recognized as work. In other words, the kinds of activities involved in defining and fixing cultural and artistic standards, fashions, tastes, consumer norms, and more strategically, public opinion. The split between conception and execution, between labor and creativity, between author and audience, is simultaneously transcended within the labor process and reimposed as political command within the process of valorization. For Lazzarato, intellectual labor, and this also implies artistic labor, I would say, is typical for new forms of exploitation under the regime of immaterial labor. It, quote, constitutes itself in forms that are immediately collective, and we might say that it exists only in forms of networks and flows. It produces, as he puts it, first and foremost a social relationship. The raw material of a material labor, as he puts it, is subjectivity, and the goal, quote, of our post-industrial society is to construct the consumer communicator and to construct it as active. The entrepreneur, still Lazzarato writing, in order to further consumption and its perpetual renewal, will be constrained to draw from the values that the public consumer produces. So Capro's shift from happenings to activities both reflects and subverts the changed nature of human labor that occurs in the 70s. In the happenings of the 60s, the production of art by the happenists and the consumption by the viewers were separated. In the activities of the 70s, production and consumption blur. As Capro himself puts it, my own stance has evolved somewhat pragmatically in actual working conditions. The participants of ecology are performing, so to speak, immaterial labor. Work and leisure, labor and play are blurred. The activity takes place on a weekend and thus after work, but it obviously consumes the time and energy of the participants who have to plan, move, follow the score, work during 2 days. The participants produce affects, memories, fun, experience, and even to some extent corporeal proximity, for instance, passing along a cup of drinking water. But the participants also undermine the process of immaterial labor and prevent their labor from being exploited. They constantly interrupt the productive cycle by loss, misunderstanding, and non-communication. They constitute subjectivity, but then deconstruct it immediately. The words are sent person to person, but too silent for them to hear, and then shouted aloud to the trees, and thus, from the viewpoint of productivity, wasted. The water is transferred mouth to mouth, and then spit into the stream. And to end, the bagged breath is open to the wind. The movement is, as Capro puts it, always back and forth. Ecology goes very far in accepting and articulating the new form of labor. It demonstrates that the studio is everywhere and that it cannot be a space protected from the reality of economic exploitation. But it also demonstrates how difficult it is for capital to draw on values which are immediately shared and available to everyone for free. Thank you for the attention.
I want to keep it very simple. I just made some notes on the way over here this morning. I came back from holidays yesterday, so I thought I will give it a real strong thinking on the way here in the plane. So I read the title, Get Out of the Studio, or Get Out of the Traditional Atelier. And then I talked to my partner this morning, and she said, did you ever do one work in your studio in your whole life? And I had to think for a little bit, and then I had to say, yes, I once did work inside of a studio, but it was not my own. But also, I don't know if I'm as an example for a good or bad artist in this context here, because I also looked at my ateliers on the way in the airplane this morning. I wrote down all the places where I lived or where I used to work. And then I thought just behind it, was it of any use, or how did it change in the distance to the place I was before? So I just give this little introduction, and then I'm going to show you a video that's 9 minutes long. If you let me play it the whole, it's fine. If you want to interrupt, you can tell me. But that's it, yeah. But maybe also just thinking about this as a summer academy, I also had to imagine that my first ideas from studios came out of Volkshochschulkurse to get ready to apply at art schools. And then after that, I would say the first thing that was my atelier was not my own children's room. I moved out of my parents' place, but then I moved in to have a studio, which was the former child room for my brother. I rolled up the carpet and I could start painting because I, wanted to prepare paintings for to get into art schools. And I didn't stay there like James Ensor did, who is a great artist who I really admired, that he stayed, I think, all of his life in the place of his mother, right? And made fantastic work. So it's even possible, I think, just to stay at your mother or your father and create your great work over there. But I mean, for me, it was also good. I also realized in the moment, because before I didn't know exactly what I was, and suddenly I had the atelier. So it was also saying, okay, similar like Philip mentioned a bit, you go to something which also defines you, because you have a studio, you're an artist. You know, you go there, and also your parents, they, you know, you're not accepted in art schools, but yet they can stay, okay, at least he's busy, he's doing there something from time to time. Then, after still, all of this summer academy didn't help me, I have to admit. So I moved to Hamburg and just went, you know, unofficially to school. I was not accepted, but I went to art school just for the first semester without really talking to the professor so much about it. So but moving to Hamburg, I was very lucky to get a studio. I could rent a place to live, which was a storefront. It was a former shop. And so I almost, looking at the years I was in Hamburg, I almost skipped the atelier to be a gallery, because with this studio I not only had a working space, I immediately had a space where I had an audience. And I think now, thinking about the studio, the great thing about it was to work in that space and work also I think in traditions also of happening and fluxus, because since I was so unsuccessful with my paintings, I learned in the first lectures that that I had in Hamburg Art School about, you know, performance art, and maybe then together with the experience of living halfway public behind this shop window, I started to make some performances, and so I would say maybe inviting people to have a shame box so they could sit inside my shop window and write down things what they feel ashamed for, or I secured my studio for 24 hours, so there was a professional surveillance and security guards coming in and checking the whole space for 24 hours. And I invited everybody from the street to feel safe and secure inside of my studio, which was my working space too. And I don't know, maybe that was because of Carrie's also description about going out of this art field, or something that you first expect that's art, you know, like for me it was painting, to suddenly see that there are other practices. And I have to say, you know, I was in art school in the early 90s, and then something that was really out and running back then was Kontextkunst, a big catalog by Peter Weibel came out. In the first pages, Peter Weibel always made photographs that on every other artist that did something in that direction before, he was 2 years earlier doing the same work. But the whole cover of the context art catalog looked exactly like the catalog from Dan Graham, Rock My Religion, that just came out, I think, a year earlier or 2 months earlier. It doesn't matter. But anyway, for me, the context art was very influential, and I thought if they already bring out catalogs about the context art, maybe I'm again too late, because about my paintings, they said, oh, this looks like art that was done in the 50s. When I showed it to professors in the art school, or abstract paintings, it's gone and it's done. And similar, I thought about the art, the Kontextkunst. So maybe, I don't know, are you familiar with this Kontextkunst? People like Christian Philipp Müller, and there was this great artist, Pearl Hirschman or Hirsch Perlman? No. What? Hirsch Perlman. I didn't hear anything from him for a long time. I think he was fantastic. Really good artist. So I mean, I was really fascinated by this, that it was artists that went into other professions, so they didn't look into the traditional studio anymore, but they said, like Julia Scher, I want to, you know, be trained like a security person, and then they went back to exhibition spaces and dressed up in uniforms like security people. And Hirsch Perlman, for example, did this great work where he also talked about the strategies of how, wie man jemanden verhört. Was heißt nochmal Verhör auf Englisch? Interrogation. Yeah, he gave all of the specific ways how to interrogate, yeah, somebody. So anyway, but I thought that's not really, that's a path that has been done before again, so I try now to work and collaborate always with other people. And so for example, I didn't do Julia Scher, I was not the security man, but I instead took then the professional company into my place. And I think I very much stick with this concept. Until now, I still don't do any work by myself, and so through these partners, through these collaborators, I constantly have always new working spaces. I'm going to be fast now. So after this time in Hamburg, living there, I moved out of that space, and for 2 years I had no place to live in. But I was just traveling around because already my working practice changed. So of course my girlfriend back then was living in Milan, and I was traveling a lot, and I was just doing this works where I worked in the space where I was showing it. For example, in Belgium, My Life as a Dove, where I was transformed by a magician for the durance of an exhibition into a dove, and the professional magician came back, retransferred me after the 3 weeks. Or when I was invited to the biennial and one work failed in Venice in '99, I was invited to do something there, and then my first project where I wanted to do a blood friendship with my idol from youth, Pierre Brice, the Winnetou actor. I wanted to make a blood friendship with him. He completely refused, so I was finding myself down in Venice, and I saw these fortune tellers on television, the cartomantes, the tarot card readers on television. So then I transformed the hotel room I was staying in Venice to call those fortune tellers on Italian television. That meant I had to stay in that hotel for 3 weeks to constantly have the line and call them to get, because many people try from the television to get this contact to the tarot card reader on television. But at the moment, whenever I got the connection, I pressed the record button. So in a way, I felt that the whole process of, not even hiring a production company to film, it was great that in that TV studio, they were then producing the film because I recorded what was just happening in television while I was giving them the questions about my work, which was the main questions between an artist and his work. Is the idea good? Was the first question to the fortune teller. Second, will I be able to realize the work? Third, will it be beautiful? And then how will the audience react? And in the last, am I enriched by the whole process of doing it and can leave and go to the next one? So these were the 5 questions to 5 different fortune tellers. Okay, but then after that I moved to Berlin, and I have to say that was the first time I had a real working space again, which was becoming a bureau. Was it good? Yes, it was a bureau. I had the first time an assistant in my life. Before I never had assistant, so I had at least when I was traveling somebody there doing correspondences and filling files and organizing different projects. So it was good, but I never did a work in this thing. So I think maybe the closest was the Friedensallee 12 in Hamburg, the shop window where I produced more. So after that, I moved to New York for 4 years, and I had this even much smaller studio over there, which was also my living room, but it was maybe like this big, and there was a bed, and then I had sometimes also more work than before. I was still traveling a lot. I had 3 assistants sometimes being in that place, so we were starting to pile up papers on the bed. And sometimes I had to make a photograph because it was so funny that we were in this little apartment and I had 3 people there, and I made an automatic camera and photographed us all. But again, it's more the whole structure behind it. I never produced anything there except one part for Performer, where I had seen, I think also about the inspiration part in the studio. I think that the studio, for me, there was also the part that I think I need these connections with people, and I think I'm only inspired by other people. And I think also for my work, you're almost, as an artist in your studio, you're God. You can create this studio as the way you want. You can do anything. You can create whatever you want after your thoughts about it. And I think that was something that really doesn't shape my work. I think my work is shaped by communication with people where they stop me doing something or where they really restrict me doing something. So in a way, this dialogue between something, another format, another, somehow, yeah. So, and now I have to say that I moved back to Berlin, having bigger spaces. I could afford some bigger spaces, and now I think I'm getting totally obsessed by spaces. As soon as artists can earn a little bit of money or some more money, they either invest also in art because they know something about art, or they buy real estate. And in the moment, I'm in the second fraction just because I thought it's so great to own a studio. And my girlfriend also is an artist. She always gets the studio visits. And suddenly I get studio visits, and I see that a studio has also something which is representative thing. So it's also not only that you feel yourself comfortable in your place and you think no one will ever steal or take away your studio, like it does, for example, Kossuth just had to move out of his studio in New York, which was massive, and he had it since 30 years, and he collected all of this stuff, and suddenly he had to move and had now to pay New York real estate money for something that he's used to live and work and collect in. And so, I don't know, I was also somehow obsessed by having a space that I think this is my own now and nobody can throw me out. And I also see that it changes from the earlier studio visits that I got, where people, more curators or people that really look into the art, they are kind of still, they look at the work and they think, oh, it's good, he's a young artist, he lives like a student, it's okay. But now on a certain point, you also see certain collectors. I see that there's a new reaction in people, how come they come in my studio and they're somehow impressed, oh, maybe he's a successful artist, so maybe his work should be good. I see in the economic factor, it makes a difference to certain people, because curators, they don't buy many times art. It's more collectors or other people that buy art, so they are impressed by big rooms. And if you look at Gurski's studio, or if you look at certain studios, it's complete also, you know, a way to represent yourself. But so I'm the bad artist. And coming to this thing, I also one thing, my partner had an idea. She said to me, oh, you know, wouldn't it be nice to also transform our studio spaces in a foundation? It could be good for our taxes, and then we can have our things in there, and you get completely museal. So the studio can potentially turn into something that will be, you know, your own museum, your mausoleum, or something where you can constantly show your ideas and what you did on Earth. And I think that maybe also are parts, now we're touching something that maybe also influences the work that I show you now. It's called Cleaning Up the Studio, and I did it after invitation to the June Paik Art Center in Korea, in Seoul. And in this museum, they have a memorabilia. So it's the old atelier from the Broome Street studio from June Paik, which June Paik, I think because of tax problems, had to make a lot of money very quick on one part. And he offered this to the June Paik Center, and they bought the June Paik studio, for the Broome Street studio. And then the Koreans were sending archivists down there. They photographed everything, all the cables, all the monitors, all of the old equipment. Thousands of objects were exactly photographed and sketched where they were lying in the studio. And the whole studio was recreated in Korea, and the objects were put precisely on the same spot how June Paik left them. And then there was glass before it. So my proposal to the museum was, I would like to hire a cleaning team from the internet to come into the studio and clean this studio up for the durance of my exhibition in this art space. So they had just had 4 cleaners to come and you know, change the objects in a way. So for me it was also a sculptural statement. But of course, you have all of the stories in mind where cleaners come somewhere and anecdotes are built that they clean up the bathtub of boys, or somebody destroys. The museum director was not there. The curator liked the work. The museum director was not there. And he said that I killed the spirit of June Paik. And yet, to make ceremonies, Korean ceremonies inside of the studio after it was attacked. Okay. This is the sound.
Sorry.
schon dabei, ne?
Ja, wir haben es auch getestet, aber jetzt geht es nicht mehr.
Ja. Alles.
Should I restart?
Ist gut, ist gut, ist gut, ist gut.
Good?
Ja, ja.
Ja.
저희가 아름다운 조선은 역사가 한 10년 정도 됐습니다. 30년은 50명에서 100명 정도가 근무를 하고 있고요. 저희들이 수소하는 공간은 주로 오피스 공간입니다. 저희들 아름다운 조선은 신앙적인 조선을 생각하고 있습니다. 신앙적인 조선을 하는 것은 자연 그대를 유지하는 것입니다. 가능한 화학 세대를 쓰지 않고 신환경 세대를 이용해서 나한테 집중하기 좋고 또 상대방한테 보여주기 위한 공간 또 생활하기 위한 좋은 공간을 마련하는 것이 아름다운 충성입니다. 저희 고객들은 저희가 청소하고 나면 굉장히 만족을 하고 있습니다. 저희도 더러운 공간을 깨끗한 청소 공간으로 바꿨을 때 정말 환희를 느낍니다. 정말 행복한 기분을 느낍니다. 고객도 마찬가지일 겁니다. 저희 아름다운 청소에는 청소에 관련이 100명 정도 있습니다. 저희 아름다운 청소와 함께 아름다운 공간을 연주하십시오.
It took 5 hours to clean the space. It took 3 weeks to recreate the studio exactly how it was before. I would not have done this if this would have been his original studio place turned into a museum. I also have to say it's only done for me because it was even a recreation already in Korea, and everything was really precisely documented how things were laying. So I think that much of the dust that they took out was Korean dust, not New York dust. And then the museum director, I think also there was a really different interpretation about June Paik. I see him as a Fluxus artist with humor, and the museum director wanted to do a kind of Genghis Khan out of him in Korea. And the curator had the same idea about June Paik as I had, because June Paik even said, if went too perfect, lieber not böse. Went too perfect, lieber not böse, right? So now even thinking about the director who reinvents like the spirit of June Paik by a Korean ritual, these monks coming in, it's funny this is quote that even June Paik said it should not be too perfect.
Okay, good evening. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be in Salzburg. Obviously, it's hard to beat a fabulous film like the one we've just seen, but I think it resonates quite well with the topic that I'm going to speak about, because it has to do with history and preservation. The title of my talk is, for this occasion, called Werkstatt Amnesia, and I'm going to speak about a project by the Danish artist collective Superflex. They did at the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven in the Netherlands in 2010. And I'm going to start, I'm sorry for the translators because I'm loosely basing myself on the essay, so thank you for the effort anyway. I'm going to start with this beautiful quote by the artist that is at the center of my talk, called Sol LeWitt, which is, I think, a mantra for many artists, that banal ideas cannot be rescued by beautiful execution. And what I'm going to talk to, it's difficult, I think, as an art historian, to speak about the studio without being prescriptive rather, to say what artists should do. So that's not what I'm going to do. I'm rather going to speak about a very peculiar move or things that have happened over the last years, and this start of belief in the post-studio, that there is no, we've seen two practices now that have a very enlightened relation towards a traditional space of art production. But it starts to get really interesting, not really interesting, critical rather, when those ideas are turned into curatorial concepts and happenings. Voilà. And this is a picture actually showing Sol LeWitt in a factory, a steel factory near Van Eindhoven called Nebato, which will be at the center of my talk in July 1968. But I'm going to speak about this project by Superflex that was in spring 2010. When you visited the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, you met a steady noise because they installed a big heavy metal workshop at the central gallery of the Van Abbe Museum. And the Danish collective was invited to do something with the collection, which is a very regular invitation towards artists to make a presentation with works, and they were very intrigued by this beautiful assembly of minimalist and conceptual works they have in Eindhoven. For those of you who have visited the museum, it's actually one of the best collections in the Low Countries. They were intrigued by the pieces they had there, and especially by this idea of dematerialization, de-skilling and delocation, and the fact that many of these works actually are contained in a formula that is then written down in a certificate, and theoretically you can reproduce it. Superflex is also interested in ideas of authorship and copyrights. So they base themselves on a very interesting and intriguing and quite difficult quote, I must say, of the artist Sol LeWitt. That is, and I'm going to read it out loud, when an artist uses a conceptual form of art, it means that all of the planning and decisions are made beforehand and the execution is a perfunctionary affair. This sort of laid the basis for what conceptual art is very much known about, that a work can exist as an idea only, and that the execution of it actually is almost an invitation, is an assignment, something you can take up. Superflex literally took this open invitation and they based themselves on it's actually a work by Sol LeWitt that is in the collection of the Van Abbe Museum. I'm going to show it in a minute. But they also took another quotation by Sol LeWitt that was about the sharing of ideas. I believe that ideas, once expressed, become the common property of all. They are invalid if not used. They can only be given away and cannot be stolen. This is a very generous position by an artist. Like, my ideas can be shared by anyone. You can use it, you can make it. So far, so good. So I'm starting, I think, very positively, and there will be a turn somewhere in the middle. And so this was a letter he wrote, he published in the magazine Flash Art after being accused of plagiat. And so if there are ideas in my work that interest other artists, I hope they make use of them. If someone borrows from me, it makes me richer, not poorer. We artists, I believe, are part of a single community sharing the same language. So Superflex took this work, which is in the collection of the Van Abbe, which is written down in a certificate. They also show the certificate in the show. It's a very simple work, a formula, 5 cubes, 5 cubes, 5 cubes, steel. You can actually make this work very easily. So that's literally what they did. They took up the invitation in the work, the formula, that you can reproduce this work ad infinitum and make it anew, basing themselves on these quotes by LeWitt. But interestingly enough, if we started with the first quote, that the execution is a perfunctionary affair, there's a first phase in this project which I think is not only artistically very problematic, but also curatorially very problematic, that the first thing they do is install very literally a workshop, a Werkstatt, that's why I called it Werkstatt Amnesia. Literally this outsourcing of labor that was inscribed within the whole logic of conceptual art. They sort of reinstall it within the museum, confronting viewers with a literal, very literal studio workshop, steel workshop that you entered into the museum. That's the first thing that is definitely problematic. But the thing that is, I think, that blew my mind and really made me angry, if I must say so, is the fact that the project was based on the idea that the museum is like a prison and that the work needs to be liberated. That's another thing that I find highly debatable, that once again the museum should be described in terms of prison-like terms, and that the work needed to be rescued and freed, that the invitation that was within the formula, the certificate, had to be opened up towards the public, and the public had to share. But obviously artworks do not reside alone in a museum, and there is this massive resource alongside it, which is the archive, that might shed light on what this work might be. And once you dig into the archive of the Van Abbe Museum, which is not very difficult, I guess, as either a curator or an artist when you're invited to do something there, there's this incredible episode that is part of the history of the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, that in the late 60s, Carl Andre, when he had a show at the Fischer Gallery in Düsseldorf, he and the collector Visser wanted to buy a work of Andre. He said, why don't you produce it? There's a nice factory I use to make my furniture. He was a furniture designer. Why don't you make the work over there? It's a lot cheaper, and then we can work together. So he did, and actually this factory in Bergegg became like a crucial point. You have many American factories that have been known for collaborating, like Lippincott, for example, with artists, but apparently near Eindhoven, there was this factory working together with, amongst others, here Robert Morris and his assistant Barbara Rose, and this cheerful meeting with, among others, Dorothea Fischer, Bruce Nauman, and Sol LeWitt. So apparently this museum in Eindhoven has this incredible history of collaborating with this whole, with a steel workshop outside, just in the vicinities of Eindhoven. So then the question is, to what extent, basically in the show, there is no trace of that history whatsoever. And then it wonders why a museum that has such a rich and enlightened vision already in the 60s to outsource the labor towards a steel factory outside needed to stage, literally inside the museum, a production process that nobody, not a single visitor, could actually participate in. And now it gets really worse. So the only participation the visitors were allowed was during the whole length of the show. They produced as many works or replicas of that Sol LeWitt sculpture as they could make. And you could sign in a formula and just sign that you might want to receive one of the Superflex Sol LeWitt sculptures. And then at the end, there was a procedure which was secret, which resembled a tombola. They just elected a few lucky winners that received a piece of the Sol LeWitt sculpture. And you had to sign this form. I'm going to translate it very quickly. By signing this form, I confirm to receive a free Sol LeWitt of Superflex of the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven. It's a project that takes place at the museum in September 2010. They make exact replicas of the artwork below by Sol LeWitt that resides in the collection of the Van Abbe Museum, and it will be, it says literally, given to visitors through a lottery. And then you get, I declare and understand to accept that free Sol LeWitt of Superflex is not an artwork by Sol LeWitt. Voila. And these are pictures you can actually find on the website of, or you could find because they've been removed. So there are a few lucky winners and they get this piece by Superflex. And then the question arises to what extent the conceptual crux of opening up the production of an artwork, describing it in a mere formula so it can be executed by anyone else, this open invitation that is a challenge actually, that is outsourced, and the picture of Sol LeWitt like checking a work at Nebato was literally the distance between the actual artist who conceived the piece and the maker. And as a viewer, participant, maker, your position is very unstable. It's very hard to decide where you are as a visitor when you face a certificate of conceptual artwork. And I think it's a very generous and difficult, critical position to relate to. How do you relate to a certificate? Suddenly, this is being reversed into a set of lucky winners that receive a piece by a free Sol LeWitt piece by Superflex. And then you get this. Then suddenly people don't know how to handle, obviously, an artwork. They wear no gloves, and they try to shove it into a thing which is very popular to rent in the Netherlands called a boedelbak. So it doesn't fit. And this is, well, it's not really funny, but it still is. People trying to squeeze in an artwork. So the question here is what this whole staging of production of a studio that never was one in the position of Sol LeWitt. And first and foremost, the conceptual and ethical position that was inscribed within that stance by LeWitt, who was an artist that was generally known as one of the most generous people in the artist community. What is actually happening in this work, in this very staging of a workplace, which at the very time of Sol LeWitt working at the Van Abbe was already outsourced. So why do sort of a mirage of productivity presented to viewers that cannot participate, can only look at what is being produced? The only participation they have is one of a lottery, a tombola, and so you may be our lucky winner today. While inscribed, and this is a quote, I think, again, this is a text written about the first piece of Soluit that was exhibited at the Van Abbe Museum, who also happened to be the first Dutch museum to show Louis. So what I'm trying to say is that this museum is such a rich collection, such an incredible, vast archive full of information about this work, suddenly turns the relationship between the artist, his work, the visitors, and the museum into a spectacle of productivity which isn't one by default. And so I'm going to end by this quote. The aim of the artist would not be to instruct the viewer, but to give him information. Whether the viewer understands this information is incidental to the artist. One cannot foresee the understanding of all one's viewers. And I think what infuriated me mostly about this project are these pictures. That's what got the whole thing going, that the museum shows these pictures as public relations imagery that is used to advocate this project, but also the literal staging of a workshop inside the main gallery of the museum, while historically they had a much more enlightened relationship towards industrial production already at the time of a very project that is at the center of Superflex's project. So the question is, I think, and I haven't resolved it, it's not a matter of who is to blame, and it's not a matter of finding the one to blame exactly, but I guess this is a project in which many things actually collide and convene into which I called amnesia, that the archival knowledge, but also the understanding of what the studio might mean as a condition is all too easily discarded. And this is a project I thought sort of exemplified this mode. Thank you.